Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this fourth episode of Serverless Deep Dives. I'm really excited about this episode. We've got a really cool lineup of guests, and I'm just excited to see what they have to say about serverless and just the stuff they've been working on. But before we get into the talks from our speakers, I just want to intro this stream again in case you haven't come before. So this stream is just about talking about serverless in general. It's hosted by Prisma. However, this isn't really a Prisma-specific stream. We just want to get sort of speakers who are working in the field talking about serverless and get their experience and sort of their insights that they've gained as they've worked in serverless settings. So the first guest that we have today is Kristi Perreault. She is joining us, and she's just going to have a chat with me about some of her experience. So I'll move over and we'll bring her on. Hey, Kristi.
Hey, thanks for having me today. Super excited to be here.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for coming on with us. I'm really happy that you're able to join. We have a list of speakers that we plan to invite to this event, and you were way up there on the list. We've seen a lot about you, and we've seen a lot of your stuff. So we're excited to have you on.
Oh, thank you so much. I actually really like the music. I was kind of getting into it while we were cutting over.
Oh yeah, yeah, it's a bop for
big
sure.
fan already.
Awesome. Well, so to get this started, I'm going to start off with some easy questions. Let's first just chat a bit about yourself and your career journey so far and where you're working right now.
Sure. So I'm an AWS serverless hero, and I work at Liberty Mutual Insurance as a principal software engineer. I've been there for my whole career now, so about 6 or 7 years already. It went by super fast. So I graduated from Roger Williams with a computer engineering degree. I interned there, and I've worked full time there. I actually got into the serverless cloud space probably about 3 or 4 years ago, as I was just going through my development journey and learning, and I just really loved how easy it was to use and to work with. And then I started getting more involved with the community and applied to the community builder program and joined that until I became a hero. And just have really enjoyed my time in this space and found a love of development with cloud for sure. And I actually recently went back for my master's degree at Boston University and finished that up about a year or two ago in the cloud engineering space as well. So I got to touch on a lot of cool things like some of the AI and machine learning space as well. And so I like to really emphasize the T skills for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really cool. Congrats on the master's degree, by the way. That's a big accomplishment.
Thank you.
So in your journey with serverless, you mentioned being an AWS hero. Can you sort of explain what that is? That I've heard the term, but I'm not sure what exactly AWS heroes are.
Sure, yeah. And I think that it probably makes sense to talk a little bit about the community builder program too, since that's open to everyone. So the AWS Hero program is a program for community members that have really kind of gone above and beyond within their community groups and been leaders or evangelists of certain technologies or disciplines within AWS. So we have machine learning heroes, we have serverless heroes, we have dev tools heroes, there's some storage heroes. So these are just folks that are really into things like blogging or videos or speaking on things like this. So I really found a love of the community after attending reInvent a couple years back. So I actually was able to apply and attend through the All Builders Welcome Grant, which I know they're also opening this year. So they covered all my costs, and I got to go to reInvent. And I just enjoyed it. I just lived it to the fullest, networked with folks, went to all different kinds of sessions, just learned a ton. And then started getting invited to things like reInvent recaps and chatting a little bit more about my serverless knowledge and how we use serverless at Liberty Mutual, and started on the speaker circuit. Like I said, applied to the community builder program, which is very similar program. So that is open to anybody to apply for. They open applications twice a year. So you can apply and join just a really awesome supportive community of people that just talk about AWS, whatever discipline that you're in. You can get certifications. You can work towards creating your own website or application. So it's just a really cool, supportive environment. So I've been an AWS hero since June of last year, so just over a year now, and I've really enjoyed the community and the other folks around me and working with them. I also forgot to mention I run or co-organize the AWS Portsmouth user group as well. So if anybody wants to join that, we have hybrid and virtual events as well as in person if you're local. So we're actually running a game day next month. So that's a great example of some of the stuff that we do as community leaders and community members.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's super cool. I maybe after the stream, if you have a link to like some information on that on that group, I'll put it in the show notes so that people can find it if they're in your area.
Definitely.
Sweet. So leading up to becoming an AWS hero and just in your career recently, what are some of the kinds of applications you've worked in that use serverless, and sort of like how did those sort of shape your view of serverless?
Yeah, so I can't get too many specifics given my job in insurance, but I just kind of broad overarching. I actually started working in a Java Spring Boot project, and this was kind of when serverless was really new, and we just started working with CFTs. So we were creating like S3 buckets and some resources that we wanted to generate in the cloud. Us as a company was starting to move to the cloud and off-prem. So I honestly just really liked working with CFTs. I loved kind of working through like the different properties that each configuration had, and then kind of testing it out and deploying it. So I really enjoyed it. It was kind of like dipping a toe into the water. And then I had an opportunity where we were putting together a serverless DevOps team at my company. So I actually moved into that space. We were a super small team, and I just started learning a ton. So it was everything from Lambda to API gateway to single table design with Dynamo. And we were just starting to build out solutions and help other teams sort of start their journey to the cloud, or to refine their cloud journey. So some folks had maybe moved in and used things like EC2 or containers and were looking to take advantage of more cost savings or optimizations. So we would kind of help them along with their journey, or create tools and patterns that they could sort of reuse and work through so that it made the hurdle to joining and getting into serverless much lower. So it kind of has progressed over time. I've done Python and TypeScript. I've had asks for Java, so I'm not really a technology snob when it comes to the serverless space. We're definitely way more into CDK here, but we also have SAM and CloudFormation templates as well. So, like I said earlier, I kind of try to branch across all of them because you never know which teams or which individuals need help, especially with Liberty Mutual having about 3,000 technology employees. So there's a lot of different work going on. So you kind of have to be a jack of all trades within the space for sure.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's a lot of people to be working with. And that leads me to a question that I've always been curious to hear from someone like you about, is when you're working on a large team in a serverless project, or a large project using serverless, what does the development process look like? It seems like there's a lot of different pieces that would be touching each other in a serverless setting. So are there any like tips or tricks for people who are also working on large serverless projects?
Yeah, I think it sort of depends on what you're trying to build out and do. One of the things that I really like that we've kind of broken things out into is usually one of two ways. I see folks breaking it out into infrastructure versus like logic. So, what we tend to do is if somebody can write maybe the Lambda logic code, whereas someone else is setting up the actual Lambda infrastructure, and maybe the API gateways or routes that you need for that. So I've seen it split kind of that way. It kind of keeps some things separate, and so that you're not stepping on too many toes. I've also seen it more where like you kind of split it out by layers in terms of things like compute versus storage versus maybe like networking, or something along those lines. So maybe you have folks that are more focused on Dynamo and the tables and queries, or you have some folks that are focused on your S3 buckets. Maybe you have some people that are focused more on like API gateway. And with us, that comes with a lot of things like security, authentication, and authorization, and some of those more difficult concepts maybe to work with or wrap your head around. So that's kind of two different pathways that I've seen some folks work with this. We try our best to break things out into microservices too, so that we're trying not to be too dependent on each other, and you can kind of work in your own space a little bit. But it's always a challenge for sure.
Yeah, cool, great. Yeah, and I'm rapid firing these random questions because I'm digging down to sort of the main point that I'm aiming to get at, and I think we're ready to get there. Is when you're developing these like microservice type applications, You're working with a big team. You're using a bunch of different AWS services. That confuses a lot of people. Or I guess I should say what's confusing to a lot of people is how you develop these. Do you develop locally? Do you develop, directly on AWS's platform? Like, how does that look when you're working on a big team? I think in the past you've mentioned something called serverless first development, and I think that probably ties into this. So, like, yeah, what's that all look like?
Sure. So, serverless first development is something that we've kind of taken as a rule of thumb at Liberty when we are approaching, problems or moving to the cloud. And that's serverless is not going to be the best fit for everything or everyone, but we're going to try that first every time because we've got a lot of great patterns set up for that. We have a lot of great expertise and knowledge at our company built up over time now of this space. Like I said, it's very cost effective. It helps with your performance, and you can break things out very easily, as we were just sort of discussing too. So it's a great way to kind of first approach your development tools. And you might find that that's not the best approach for you. You could have certain constraints, or maybe you're working with really, really large data sets or something, or you've got vendor lock-in, so you're going to stick to something more like containers or maybe EC2 or something along those lines. So you kind of work your way down the stack, but we always start with serverless first, as that's the best fit for a lot of the well-architected pillars. So we can talk a little bit about that too, but we focus a lot on, if you haven't heard, it's a way of development where you're focused on building your apps the best way that you possibly can. And there's 6 different pillars associated with that, which is security, cost, optimization, operational excellence, reliability, performance, and sustainability. So there's a whole framework within AWS. You can read all about it in their white papers. And there's actually a service set up within the AWS console where you can walk through sort of like a well-architected review of your applications. So they ask you questions that line up with each of those pillars that help you sort of think about how you're building your application in the best way possible. So, for us, big ones are security and cost. As a large Fortune 100 company dealing with a lot of personal data and things, we tend to preference those questions over some of the other ones because it is a trade-off and balance. You're not always going to be perfect across the board with all 6 of those things. But we find that serverless really answers a lot of our questions for some of those reviews and helps us get to that optimal state. Gotcha. So in order to help us with that, we have created a ton of different patterns or sort of blueprints that you can walk through and start with. And that has some of those security things or those cost considerations or some of those performance ideas situated for you so that you don't have to go out and reinvent the wheel every single time for these sorts of things.
Yeah, that's really cool. I hadn't heard of the term serverless first development before, but it sounds like a really cool practice to put in place. And it gets me wondering, do you find that serverless, after going through these pillars and weighing the trade-offs, have you found that it tends to cover most of the scenarios where you can go forward with serverless? Or do you find yourself reaching back to a server full infrastructure more often than you would like?
I would say that I've seen a lot of folks go in serverless first. The times where we maybe don't do that is, like I said, with some of the vendor lock-in, or when we have really large applications, monolithic applications that we've maintained for years that maybe have 100 people working on them, that you kind of need to chisel off bit by bit and get everybody collaborating, which is almost the harder part. We're pretty sold on the serverless approach, but it is very difficult to kind of find those slithers and break that out and to have people kind of collaborate on that large of a scale for legacy applications. But for greenfield new application, yes, we really tend to head towards that serverless mindset, and they do answer a lot of our questions for well architected and covering a lot of those pillars. I'd say the toughest one is probably sustainability. That one I can see overlapping a little bit more with maybe big data or some of this AI machine learning places where you can kind of think more about your footprint, whereas that's a really hard thing to think about in terms of the serverless ecosystem because you're already trimmed a lot of the fat there. So that one's probably a tougher one to sort of work its way in. And it's the newest. It was only announced a year or two ago now at reInvent. So I think that they're still learning a lot about that and pointing people in the right direction for answering some of those questions.
Gotcha. Yeah, very cool. Nice. So before you had mentioned that you tend to work a lot with CDK.
Mhm.
Is that how you like you'd mentioned like you have like reusable things that or bits of infrastructure that you use and have set up so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel a bunch of times. Is that where CDK comes in? Is that sort of what helps you build those?
Yeah, CDK is an awesome tool. So if you haven't heard of it, it's the cloud development kit. And actually, this reminding me of things I should have mentioned in my intro too. I actually am one of the organizers for CDK Day, which will be at the end of September. So we're still accepting applications for that as well. So we'd love to see your talk there if you're interested too. But CDK is a really awesome, powerful tool for infrastructure as code. So instead of defining all your resources in JSON or YAML like you normally would in CloudFormation, um, the CDK allows you to define your infrastructure in things like Python or TypeScript. Those are probably two of the most popular ones we have at Liberty. Yes, we do find that it's a lot of the same code to set up, right? Like if I'm creating a Lambda function, chances are that there's a team, a couple removed from me that's also doing the same thing. And there's only so many things you can choose from with those stuff, right? Like maybe the language type, you'll put in the name of the handler and some of those things, but the basic bare bones of that is going to be exactly the same across the board. So what we've done is sort of centralize these patterns so that everybody has that same starting point. They know where they're going. They don't have to kind of start from scratch or pull together the docs and figure out how they stand up an S3 bucket and a Lambda function and a Dynamo table. So we find that that's really helpful. We've also seen a lot of teams come up with kind of their own libraries or create some of their own CDK constructs. So there's different levels of constructs with the CDK, and it's kind of a way where you can bundle some of those resources together so that instead of writing 20 lines of code to create your S3 bucket with a policy, you can simplify that into a construct, and then it's one line of code just to bring that whole construct in, because you always know you're going to use the S3 bucket with this certain policy. So instead of writing that out every time, we can bring that in. So it's really promoted reuse, it's promoted collaboration. It's a great way for people to kind of have really consistent development efforts across the organization too, because obviously we're dynamic, we're ever changing, people are moving teams, or we're bringing new folks in. So this is a great way to kind of standardize across the organization, and to allow folks to have a place to sort of start and feel comfortable with.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. I have limited experience with CDK. I've played with it a little bit to put up some very simple applications. And from what I've seen, I could see how it can be really powerful in allowing you to sort of, like you said, build these sort of bundles so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel a bunch of times. A question that I see rise a lot around CDK and developing that way is how do you test the infrastructure that you're defining via CDK? Are there good tools out there for testing the infrastructure and making sure it all looks good before you actually deploy it and start incurring cost on the AWS dashboard?
Yeah, that's definitely a great question. I think that testing is always a huge pain point with serverless development in general, whether you're doing CDK or CFT or anything along those lines. I don't know if there's like a 100% great solution that I've found. I'll say that some of what I've done is the CDK book actually breaks down testing CDK, as in writing unit tests or
Mm,
infrastructure tests. So I rely on that quite a bit. Because I think that that's really helpful. Another thing is that CDK, obviously, it will compile down to a CloudFormation template. So before you deploy it, I always run a CDK synth is the command, and it'll generate the template for you, or it'll show you where you have errors and where it prevented you from creating the template. So
mm,
that's a great check where you can kind of actually just go through the CFT and like say everything looks good. This is exactly what I expected. This is how I want it to generate, and CDK will tell you if it's incorrect or you created something wrong, and it won't generate the template properly. So I think that that's a great check with your infrastructure tools. I've done some local testing in lower level environments. So CDK also has CDK deploy where you can deploy right from the command line. So it makes it really iterative and easy to kind of work through. Or doing just manual testing with, submitting my own events through my own Lambda functions locally, especially with things like Python. You can run that really easily with just a Python script and pass through the event that you're expecting. And then you can kind of see those resources and those tools sort of come through. So Lower level environments, I definitely take advantage of in development or a non-prod account, and sort of work through those challenges there. And then, like I said, writing tests and then doing some manual testing just locally with your own created or generated events. But I do know that this is a space that a lot of people are very interested in improving and making better. I know that AWS has started to actually tie CDK a little bit more with AWS SAM, which is the serverless application model. And that is also a tool that's defining your infrastructure as code in JSON or YAML. But they have specific serverless type resources. So they make the configuration of that a little bit simpler for you, especially for like Lambda functions and an API gateway. And they have some of their own commands and local testing and stuff that they've actually worked with the CDK team to take advantage of, so that you can use some of those SAM commands and work with your and test locally with some of your CDK work. I haven't dove into it myself too much. I've heard good things though, and I know that they're definitely working to make working with both of those tools much easier.
Interesting. Yeah, no, it's great to hear that they're sort of pushing on that, because it's something, like you said, that gets brought up a lot. I've seen it a lot, just in socials and forums where people are asking how to verify things are working. You mentioned a couple times locally testing these things, and that leads me to the question: do you tend to develop and build these infrastructures locally? Does that just sort of come with CDK? And because I've seen some people have the opinion they like developing locally in like an emulated AWS environment, or they like pushing to AWS and making sure it's actually working in production. Do you have opinions about that?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And actually, it probably calls out something that I should have specified is so at Liberty Mutual, we're dealing with a lot of personal data and customer data. So we have a lot of really strict security requirements, and one of those things is that I only have read-only access in the console. Maybe one or two low-level environment accounts, I'll actually have access that I can kind of play around with some stuff. But generally, I can't just go into the console and create things, which is why things like CDK and CFTs are very, very popular here, because we need to do infrastructure as code. So we have a lot more sort of red tape around our build and deploys, which makes it really hard to kind of iterate on some of those things. So we don't typically try to emulate environments locally, or do like really quick kind of pushes up as much, which is why I say I rely a lot more on like our development accounts or our non-prod accounts, because those are much easier to kind of push to and to work with and to develop on. So we do tend to do a lot of local development, and that's why writing the tests and to run through those like manual tests with your own simulated sort of events is really, really helpful for us, because there's certain things that we just can't work with in the console. And then as part of that, there's a lot of great services and tools out there for AWS as well. But every time AWS announces a new service, we actually have to go through an entire process to list it and verify it and make sure it's covering some of our basic requirements like encryption in transit or encryption at rest, and some of those things. So it is a little bit slower than maybe it would be for development in a community project or at a smaller company. So we have some of our own unique requirements that we work through, but there's ways to work with that and to kind of make your lives a little bit easier with testing.
Yeah, for sure. I imagine with any big company, there's always going to be some custom process that maybe slows things down just to meet requirements.
Yep.
But yeah, it's cool to get some insight into how things are working at Liberty Mutual, just because I think that is the big question. We've talked about this on the show in the past, is like, what does it look like for a large company or an established company to adopt serverless when they're so ingrained in this serverful model? It's very cool to see, like at Liberty Mutual, that it is possible. You just have to have engineers dedicated to doing it and understanding the trade-offs. Has that been a hard challenge to sell to Liberty Mutual in the past, or like when you were first moving to serverless?
Yeah, I think that you mentioned like you need the developers. I think equally though, you need the leadership to be really on board with that too, and to support those decisions and to be willing to take those risks, and work with your experienced engineers or architects to kind of make that more of something that can be adopted. So I think historically in the past, we've done a really great job at being open-minded with those things. Leadership's done a great job at kind of listening and understanding what the need is and why it's beneficial and what makes sense. So I think that you kind of need everybody on board. Product too is a big one. But like you said, it's definitely doable. I mean, we're a large company. We've been around for over 100 years now. So we have a lot of legacy code. We've got a lot of tech debt, and we're still able to do it. You're starting to see it more with other large companies too. I mean, I know that they've had Capital One on stage. They've had one or two of the airline companies on stage at reInvent in the past, also doing the same thing. So, and we're getting to that point where I think that it's more widely accepted and easier to do. And I think that some of it too is that it was so new for so long, and now we're kind of at a point where it's starting to level off a little bit, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think it's showing that we have the time to dedicate now to building really robust tools to help with this development process. We're building up the education and the expertise within companies and individuals and across the community. I mean, there's tons of blogs and resources and videos and websites and project examples and everything that you can point to now, and sort of get your questions answered. So I think that you're going to see it probably be more of a thing as in larger companies as time goes on.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I totally agree with that. That once you see something sort of like there's the initial hype, and then once it sort of flattens out, that's when things really mature. That's when things start to become more accessible to the average developer rather than just the people who are playing with the new stuff. So it's exciting to see things get there. Do you think that now that we are sort of reaching this plateau, do you think that there's any specific areas of serverless that really need, a little bit of love to get this pushed even further? We've talked about testing, we've talked about local versus development in the actual platform itself. Are there other areas that are just kind of difficult to work with right now?
Yeah, I think that that's a good question. I would say there's always going to be room for improvement, right? I actually think that the CDK repo, so it's an interesting hybrid where AWS supports it, and they have a team for it, but they allow community contributions. And if you go in there, there's actually like 3,000 issues in GitHub still that you can go and upvote or find. So I'm in there quite a bit, trying to see if somebody's had the same issue that I have. So I think that there's always going to be room for improvement. There's always going to be new feature requests. There's always going to be things coming down the pipeline that'll just make development easier and better. I think that specifically with serverless, we're still seeing it. I mean, I think AJ actually put out a really great article. He's one of the other AWS serverless heroes on how they've worked to minimize cold starts with your Lambda functions as well too. So I think it's just going to be a series of incremental changes that will continue to make these services and these resources easier and better to work with. But I think we have hit a point where there's not going to be like 10 announcements at reInvent this year that's going to completely change the game and switch everything up. But I do think that there's a ton of value in all of those little tweaks or new properties that they add. And they are pretty good about listening to user requests. And, if you can get an issue on GitHub and get it upvoted and shared out there, you can probably find a solution or build one yourself with the community contribution model as well.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's great. Now, before we were sort of chatting to get you on the show, you'd mentioned something called something about shifting left developer tooling for cloud environment. Can you sort of explain what that is? In my head, I was trying to wrap around like what that means.
Yeah. So that's basically like, I want to bring, and it's to your point more about like the testing and the local development too, is that, I'm really focused right now on bringing the experience of end-to-end development, closer to you and your environment. So as I mentioned earlier, some of the pain points are you run into roadblocks or red tape when you're hitting your pipelines, your builds, your deploys. I want to bring some of that a little bit closer to the developer. And one great example of this is like VS Code plugins. So being able to kind of show some of those things, like the CFN lint plugin is awesome. So I think that there's some untapped things in there that would really be helpful. And I think that that's where a lot of the industry is shifting to. Stack Overflow just announced today that they have a new AI assisted VS Code plugin, which would be really cool so that you can get your questions answered like right in your development environment. Because historically what we've seen is that, developers don't want to have 10 tabs open and switching between products and trying to test with this thing and that thing. So it'd be really awesome to consolidate a lot of that closer to the developer. And in my mind, that looks like in your IDE where you're actually doing that development work. So you can work with these things and not have to continually switch tabs or change gears or log into a new platform or do something different. It's all kind of right there for you in a seamlessly integrated experience. So that's kind of where I see some of this evolving. Serverless has a place in this. I think some of the AI stuff has a place in this. Cloud in general does. So I think that that's sort of our next evolution and where we're headed and where I'm thinking about these things. So it's an exciting space. It's a really cool opportunities there, I think, especially with the AI boom right now. So that's kind of what that means and what I'm looking at currently.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, that's super interesting stuff. And I think, improving basically what you're getting at is the developer experience of putting together these things.
Mhm.
There's a lot of room for improvement there. And yeah, it's going to be super cool to see where people get with all of this.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're coming up on time for our session. So thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for answering all of my rapid fire questions in such a limited amount of time. I really appreciate it. And I think next we're going to bring up Stephen Tay. So I'll go ahead and bring you off for now, and then we'll see you back on the panel.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hey, Stephen.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, pretty good. How are you doing today?
Pretty well myself. Thanks so much for having me here.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for joining us. To start off this, why don't you just give us a little bit of a background, who you are, where you work, and what you've been working on?
Sure. My name is Steven. I am a senior developer advocate here at Vercel. I've been building a lot of Next.js related templates in the last couple of years, notably the platform starter kit, which uses Prisma, and it's a simple template for people to build multi-tenant applications and offer custom domains in your applications really easily. I also maintain and manage the templates marketplace product at Vercel, which is basically just this gallery of amazing templates that are built by both our team and also folks in the community, be it Next.js templates or Svelte or Remix, all the different frameworks that are out there. Recently, I've been building a lot of AI-related templates as well, and that's been really exciting. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really cool. And if I understand correctly, you have a project that you're going to be sharing today with us and sort of talking through, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. Why don't we jump into that? I think I'm really excited to see what this is.
Let's do it.
Cool.
Let's dive right into it. Let me just share my screen real quick.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this demo is just a small little app that demonstrates how you can use Next.js's latest server actions feature in your application. So to understand what server actions is, let's dial it back a little bit and look at how we usually build forms and user actions and stuff like that inside your Next.js application. If you're not familiar with what Next.js is, it's basically a framework that's built on top of React that allows you to build really high performant and powerful full stack applications. And the way folks usually build forms is we would create a form component. And here we have right on the left, you can see the old form component. And within that form, we will have a non-submit action. If you're familiar with React, it's basically for you just to submit a form, and we will fetch an API endpoint that we will define in our application. Here, I'm doing a post request to create a new post, and basically after that, we submit a toast, and that's it. So let me just take a look at the. Actually, let's go ahead and submit a form. So Prisma serverless. Talk about server actions, and when I click submit, what happens is it basically submits a form and then it validates the form. There's a div right below the form that has a list of all the created posts. So here on the left, we go back to our code again. We see that we have an API function, an API route, Here we have a post endpoint that creates posts and a delete endpoint that deletes posts. So let me go ahead and delete this one. As you can see, it deletes the post and it revalidates the list of posts. So it works. It's the usual way people create user interactions in your application. But at the end of the day, you are essentially writing a lot of boilerplate code. For example, to do this, you'll need to create a new API route. You'll need to define the post endpoint. You'll need to stringify your body when you send it to the backend. And that's just a lot of extra code that can be simplified. So recently, Next.js released this new feature. It's still in alpha. We're very experimental. It's called Server Actions, and it's basically a way for you to interact with your backend directly using just pure JavaScript without needing to write any boilerplate API routes, all those stuff. There's been a lot of funny memes. I think there was one that where people turned the Next.js logo into a PHP logo because this is very similar to what PHP has been doing over the years. And I believe Remix has been making some advancements in this area as well. So yeah, we're very excited about this feature, although I do need to mention the caveat that this is very experimental, and using this will basically opt you into the experimental channel for React. So use it with caution. But let me go ahead and show you what the difference is here. So going back to the page itself, I'm going to replace the old form with a new one. So it's just called the actions form. And I'm also going to replace, I believe I have a post. I'm going to replace the button here to the new button, right? And let's take a look at what's the difference here. So in the new form, we basically only need to, we basically use, we have an asynchronous function called create posts. And that essentially does the exact same thing as the API route without all the fluff. So let me actually close this out. And let's go to actions. And here we can see that it's literally just a JavaScript function that creates a post using Prisma. And the cool thing about server actions is you also have this new form status hook that allows you to detect when a form is being submitted, and you can go ahead and do stuff like make the button, disable the button, and change the color, and put like a loading animation. So let's go ahead and do the same thing here. Talk about server actions. You'll notice that the interaction is pretty much the same, right? You submit a form, has a loading state, and then a toast comes out with the revalidate function. So, but the difference here is you no longer need all the boilerplate code to set up the API routes, and you don't need to manually define a state for set submitting. All you need is just to call that hook, and there's this pending attribute that you can use to determine if the form is being submitted. And on the front end, it's essentially mixing the front end and the back end together. So here we're just calling a create post function that creates a post for you in the back end. And we'll have to define use server at the top of the file, while the form itself is actually a client component. So yeah, that's literally it. And to delete the post, it's a similar. Let me go ahead and open that up. It's a similar interaction here. So let's see, where's the delete button? Okay, right here. So the delete button is also, again, calling an asynchronous function called delete post. And here we're, instead of using form actions, we're actually using the use transition hook in React. This is actually not experimental. You can already start using it. But it's a transition, it's a hook that basically allows you to perform asynchronous actions and basically trigger a loading state in the button that's triggering that action. So here, let's go ahead and delete this post. You can see that there's a loading state, and then bam, a toast is emitted when the post is deleted. So let's go ahead and take a look at the delete post function. Super simple stuff. Literally don't need to write anything like, return next response.json success true. All you need is write pure JavaScript, and you're able to build a full stack application. So I have to give a warning here. When you there's this saying, it's a funny saying that we've been talking about ourselves and the Next.js team, but basically when you start using server actions, there's no going back because it's just so easy to use, and you kind of like like inadvertently hate writing API routes and all the stuff that you've been doing before. So there's definitely this is a new approach to creating forms and interactions in Next.js applications. That I'm very excited for, and we've actually been implementing this in some of our templates. So recently we relaunched the new version of the platform starter kit that I was talking about earlier. And in this starter kit, everything is run purely on server actions. So you can see that we have a lib actions file, and within that, we have all the actions such as creating a site, creating a post, updating a site, etc. So if you want a more like full stack example, you can definitely check this template out. I'll share a link in the chat. I'll also share a link to the code that I demoed earlier in the chat as well. It's actually on GitHub already. Let me just copy that. So yeah, that's basically it. I hope this was helpful. We also have some docs on server actions. If you want to check that out, it's on the Next.js docs page. But yeah, I hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for walking us through that. That's actually really cool. I've seen server actions and I've read up a little bit on them, but I haven't actually gone through and like looked at an application using them. So it's nice to see. I grew up sort of in my career in Cold Fusion, which is really similar to PHP. So this whole paradigm is very familiar to me. Like you said, a lot of people made that meme with PHP versus Next. So I kind of understand that, but it's cool to see it coming up again in newer technologies.
Mm-hmm.
You always hear about this cycle where like technologies phase out and then they come back in, but they're better next time.
Exactly.
And I think this is just the next iteration of making this paradigm of programming even better.
100%. It's like the unbundling of tech and the rebundling of tech like 20 years later.
Right.
With like, Google, and then people unbundling it, and then it's going to consolidate again in the future. So we see this as like the future, the direction where Next.js is going towards. And we're very excited for people to try it out. Although I have to mention the caveat again that it's experimental. So, but there are already folks using it in production. So yeah, it's up to you if you want to try it out. But I think there's definitely a lot of value in it.
Awesome. Now, when you set up a server component like that, like in the actions that you had, what I'm curious about is how does that get deployed?
Yeah.
And how is it safe? Is that deployed as a serverless function?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had the exact same question earlier this week when I was preparing for this talk. I was like, I probably should check with the Next.js team to make sure I'm not spewing some crap on this session here. So I checked with the team, and so when you deploy a server action, it is compiled as a serverless function. It's compiled as a Lambda function, essentially. And depending on the runtime, obviously, you could be using it as an edge function or a serverless function. But essentially, under the hood, it is still a serverless function that scales infinitely. And but basically, on the surface, you don't really see any API routes, and it's essentially not as easy for people to reverse engineer API in a way, which adds to the security aspect. But yeah, under the hood, I don't know the exact percentage, but it's quite similar to the normal serverless functions.
Okay, gotcha. No, that's really cool. It kind of shows like the contrast between different ways to develop serverless. Like in Kristi's talk, we were talking about a highly custom system where people are using, the CDK to develop large infrastructures with serverless. But it sounds like Next.js is providing a really easy way for you to just focus on the code and let Vercel worry about what the infrastructure should look like and how it's deployed.
Exactly. We recently had our CTO Malta actually created this blog post called Infrastructure as Code. I might be butchering the title, but it's somewhere along the lines of how we want developers to be able to focus on the application logic, such as building forms, creating nice, front end design and UI, and basically not have to worry about the infrastructure itself. Like, will this scale? Will this, how do you actually, connect this to a Kubernetes cluster, make sure it runs, without you having to worry about it crashing and stuff like that. So it basically takes the complexity of infrastructure and a lot of this scaffolding away from the developer, and allow you to focus on what truly matters, which is your product and your user experience. So
yeah, the blog article you mentioned, I remember seeing that, and it's absolutely interesting, and it also goes along the same lines of another article that's been mentioned on this show a couple times in the past. Is I think Swix posted something about a self-provisioning runtime, and I think this is a push very much in that direction, where Next.js is saying, hey, you write your code, don't worry about the infrastructure, we're gonna do that for you. And I honestly, it's something that's been interesting to me for a long time and that I'm constantly keeping my eyes on, and I see as the future of development in general, and it seems like Vercel sort of has the same mindset there.
Yeah, I think what a lot of the new, the values and the new features that are coming on Next.js is very reflective of what Vercel, what we believe internally, and set out on our mission to do, which is basically to make developers' lives easier and allow you to focus more on your product. And I'm really excited to see all these new innovations, because there are actually a lot of success stories with folks using Next.js on Vercel being able to build really large scale applications that serve tens of millions of page views per month and not having to worry about scaling or anything like that. An example that comes to mind is super.so. They are like a Notion to website builder that serves 17 million page views per month, has I think tens of thousands of custom domains connected to one single project, and it basically uses the platform starter kit that I was mentioning earlier. And the cool thing about that is the team is very lean. It's literally one very technical founder, and he's able to build a really large scale platform by utilizing the Next.js framework and also relying on Vercel's infrastructure. So yeah, we've seen a lot of success stories like this. This is just one of many. And I think Prisma really played a huge role in that too. A lot of the new applications and starter kits that we build are actually using Prisma. And the type safety aspect is just so valuable when it comes to building all these interactions out. Not having to worry about, did I, would there be SQL injection in the code that I wrote or stuff like that? But Prisma just takes care of everything under the hood. So I think there's a lot of alignment between Prisma and Next.js. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great to hear. So as you've been developing on this platform starter kit and just other things that you've worked on during your career, what do you see as some of the challenges that you face when working in a serverless setting?
That's a great question. I think there are trade-offs with serverless. On one hand, serverless does give you pretty much infinite scale. You don't really have to worry about having a lot of users crash your site. But on the other hand, there are cases where DDoS attacks and people just running malicious code can be operationally expensive and also hurt your bank, because you end up incurring a ton of Lambda invocation costs. That's something that we're very aware of at Vercel, and we've been releasing a lot of nice new features, such as there's this recent one which is recursion protection, that basically cuts off a function if it keeps if it basically goes into a while loop, to basically avoid you from incurring thousands of dollars in serverless execution charges. So that's something that's definitely there. It's like the Pandora's box. I don't know if that's the right word, but like a double-edged sword in a way, with great power comes great responsibility.
Right.
But I think we're more focused on observability and having alerts in place. I think that's a really good way it's a more reactive way, I would say. From a proactive aspect, we've been doing a lot of, like, for example, recursion protection and a lot of different features for people to not fall into all these pitfalls when developing in serverless.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned upcoming features and just a focus on observability, and that's something that I've seen as maybe a challenge, or maybe just something people don't really understand super well in a serverless setting right now. I guess with Vercel putting some focus on that, do you see this becoming less of a problem in the future, or do you see it as a problem even right now?
So the way we do observability here, oops, my screen just locked itself. So we've been, over the last year and a half, we've been releasing a couple of big features in the observability space. More notably, we improved our logs feature, and also we added a monitoring feature for you to keep a close eye on which routes are incurring the most amount of serverless execution. And through that, users are really able to identify and basically cut off any API endpoints that are causing all this extra costs. Although there's a feature that I've been pushing a lot for us to release, which is real-time notifications, where, like, if a particular endpoint or page is getting a bunch of usage, you will get a ping via email or in-app on notifications. I think we've been improving on the notifications part, but I'm very excited to see this become a much more normal part of people's workflow on Vercel.
Gotcha. Very cool. Sweet. Well, yeah, thanks for showing us your project. Thanks for having this chat with me.
Of
I
course.
think we're getting up on time, where we're going to go ahead and start the panel now.
Sure.
So what I'm going to
share
do,
the links in the chat
Yeah.
so people can try it out for themselves. But
Awesome.
thank you so much for this.
Yeah,
This
of
is awesome.
course. I'm going to transition over now, and I'll bring everybody else on stage, and we'll get going on this panel. All right, full screen again. Nice to see you all here. Thanks for, first of all, yeah, Stephen and Kristi, thanks for joining us on this episode today. It's been a lot of fun. And we have another new face on here. If you've seen the previous episodes, you probably know who this is. This is Tyler. And Tyler, why don't you introduce yourself for the people who haven't seen you yet?
Yeah, sure thing. Hey, everyone, I'm Tyler Binfield. I'm a staff software engineer here at Prisma. I primarily work on the Prisma data platform. So if you're not familiar with that, we currently have two products, Accelerate and Pulse, in early access. And they're built serverless first, as Kristi talked about. So I'm really excited to talk about that today.
Awesome. Cool. Well, if anyone in the audience has questions for any of us, feel free to put them in the comments. We'll address them. But if not, in the meantime, I have some other questions that we'll start off with while you come up with some. So the first question, we sort of touched on this a little bit in our talk, Kristi, but I want to get all three of your guys' opinion on local development versus production-like development. I've seen about like a 50-50 split in people who really love developing locally, their serverless applications, and people who love developing like directly on the platforms themselves so that they get that production-like experience. So Tyler, why don't we start with you, since you're new up here on the screen, and just get your idea about this.
Yeah, I personally do a lot locally. So we build a lot on Cloudflare. I don't think that's any secret. We talk about that quite a bit. And the tooling around that is really good. And I see the same coming from like Next.js, where the local emulation is really accurate to what the deployed environment is. So I love that type feedback loop that it gets. I do think the ecosystem's still evolving. We're still getting better. It's still not, in many cases, like one for one with maybe production, especially when it comes to things like benchmarks or something like that. But the runtime behavior is getting really close. And I think that's really incredible because we can see these really tight feedback loops as we're developing, and in some cases even go in and add a breakpoint into the serverless function and see it stop, inspect everything, just like what we're used to with normal application development, but now in a really isolated, microservice sort of way.
Yeah,
definitely. Awesome. Steven, what do you think?
I love that. I think I also do a lot of local development, and there's the consistency between local and production is huge when it comes to choosing a framework. Next.js is pretty solid in that sense, although there are sometimes some rough edges that I do bring back to the team, and I can see why that's such an important aspect to the developer experience. There's also something that we've been working on at Vercel, which is preview comments, and that's a feature that allows you to essentially, when you push to a new branch on Git, we create this, it's a CI/CD thing where it basically creates this new preview URL that you can share with your team and leave comments on exact positions on the DOM itself to basically say, this div is it's not aligned properly, the border radius is broken, stuff like that, and it's basically really helps speed up the iteration cycle and allow teams to collaborate more efficiently. And that's something that I'm very excited about. Next.js also has this thing called draft mode, where you can basically hook it up to a CMS of your choice, Sanity, whatever, and be able to very quickly preview exactly what your content looks like on a production level environment without having to push to production and test in production. So yeah, that's basically something that we believe very deeply here. I personally resonate as well. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. And Kristi, I know this is a repeat question for you, but do you have any other thoughts on this?
No, I agree with everything that has been said so far, and yeah, I mean, I'll definitely reiterate for us, it's some of it's down to constraints, and what we can do in a corporate environment. So we definitely rely a lot on local testing and development, more so than on the platform, given our access and requirements.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. And I think a lot of what all three of you are talking about really shows sort of like what you were talking about during our chat about this plateau that we've hit where things are just going to start maturing. I see so many cool features coming out with Next.js, the way we're developing at Prisma, just finding new tooling to help us develop in serverless settings. I'm just seeing these tools mature. And basically, what this ends up being is that serverless becomes more accessible to the average developer or team. And that's an exciting thing to see, given the state of serverless a couple of years back, how it was widely misunderstood and not used to the extent that it is today. So for the next question, I think we'll start with you, Steven. I want to get an idea of what your favorite tools are working in serverless. And I feel Next.js is a valid option, so you can choose that for sure. But yeah, what are some of the tools that you guys really enjoy working with in serverless?
I love this question because there are a lot of tools out there, but at the end of the day, there are just a handful of them that we use on a day-to-day basis and literally cannot live without. The Prisma client is one of them, obviously, like being able to interact with your database very easily, being able to sort and filter. That's something that I use pretty much every time I touch my code base. So that's one. Copilot, everyone knows about it. I'm not going to talk too much about it. There's this third one that's called Ingest. It's a new platform that allows you to handle background jobs and queues super efficiently. It's spelled Ingest with two N's, INNGEST. And it's something that I've been playing around with in my side projects and also some production level tools that I've been building. The developer experience it gives when it comes to accurately creating cron jobs and background processes is actually really cool. I'm not gonna go too deep in this segment right now, but highly recommend y'all check it out. It's they have a Prisma client-ish interface where it's like in local development, you spin up like localhost colon 388, I forgot the number, but basically it allows you to visualize exactly when the background process is happening and not. So that's a new one that I've been playing around recently. So yeah, those are my top three, I guess.
Awesome, really cool. And what about you, Tyler?
Yeah, I'll focus on observability a little bit because I think in serverless that's a pretty big benefit, especially when you have a lot of distributed services. We've had a big push on observability internally as well. Things like having good log exports from the platform to somewhere that you can troubleshoot at. Having distributed tracing has been really powerful, especially when you have those services talking to each other. Being able to build one continuous trace and have that visualized and some really good tool for that is super powerful for debugging. And also having really good metrics to capturing how your service is behaving, what its overhead is, performance, how people are using it. That there's high level numbers that you can then aggregate in a chart somewhere. Gives you a lot of a perception of how things are doing and what your user experience is. So I find myself spending a lot of time there. And there's always the local tools, like I use VS Code or like a reverse proxy locally to connect back to my local machine. But I think observability is something I like to call out in serverless.
Yeah, absolutely. And are there any specific tools that you use to like help this along?
Yeah, so we've got OpenTelemetry as a standard out there. That's what we use for all of our tracing. We also visualize it. We use Axiom, but there's many other tools out there to do that too. They recently added a really good support for seeing the full distributed trace. I found it to be awesome. Our logs go there as well, so we can search them really accurately. And we're building a lot of stuff on Cloudflare. So we have Log Push as a service that Cloudflare runs to export your logs. So any of your console logs out of the workers that we deploy, they just get shipped over to Axiom, where then we can filter and sort them and run all kinds of aggregation against them.
Nice, very cool. Yeah, I've seen that we use Axiom internally. I haven't played around with it much myself, though, so I'll have to jump in there and I'll have to get with you, and you can show me how it works and what it looks like. And Kristi, how about you? Any cool tools that you really like using?
Yeah, a couple come to mind, but actually, since Tyler was just talking about observability, the one that came to mind for me that we actually like to use a lot is Lambda Power Tools, which hits on all of the same things: the tracing, the logging, the metrics. And actually, they've recently announced that they're kind of expanding just outside of the observability space into more areas too. And it used to just be for Python, and it's actually now for other languages as well. So that one's really cool for that, and it's a quick one-line annotation. So it really enables those things like almost out of a box for you. And then obviously, big fan of CDK. Also do some stuff with SAM and CloudFormation. We do have some folks that like to utilize serverless framework a bit as well too. So I think that that's a really popular one. And I also am a big VS Code developer, so I like using a lot of the VS Code plugins. I mentioned CFN Lint earlier. There's like an equivalent one for CDK. And AWS also recently announced Code Whisperer not too long ago, which is a machine learning powered tool that will give you some live code recommendations while you're building out your templates and infrastructure and stuff. So some really awesome tools out there.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard of Code Whisperer. I'll have to look into that. That sounds very cool. Awesome. Now, the next question I have is, what do you guys see as some of the more common problems that people face when they're just getting into serverless? Like these conceptual problems that you need to understand to know like how serverless works and how it fits in an application. And Kristi, let's go ahead and start with you.
I was hoping you'd start with me because I have an answer ready. I'm sorry.
Nice.
So, one of the things that we really like to share, and I know I've talked a lot about like, blueprints and patterns and how that's great to help that initial hurdle of getting started with serverless. But obviously it's just a starter pattern, right? So you just get bare bones stuff. You get a Lambda function, and then you get like a basic API gateway with some of our sort of authorization stuff around it, and then like a Dynamo table. But I think that it's like we've started to see that learning curve hit pretty hard after that. So I think that folks like really understand like that's a basic building block, but it kind of starts getting tricky when you have to start customizing that to be your own thing. So they're like, well, I need like this certain route, or actually this is the wrong type of API gateway that I need. So like, now what? So we're kind of like infamous for saying that, we can get an intern deploying to prod within 10 minutes with some of our applications, but it's not going to be a robust app, right? It's not going to have what they need or what's going to fill the solution there. So that's definitely a space where we're trying to work at on a large scale of education and learning and kind of seeing. And, I work at the service desk quite a bit. So this is where I get a lot of those questions is, I get it that it came out of the box, but like, what does it actually do? And like, what happens when I need to change it to be specific to what I'm working with?
Yeah.
So I think that we probably need that evolution and that gap a little bit more. And it's one place where I feel like the AWS documentation lets us down a little bit because there's not too much on some of those IAC pieces or how to do some certain things in with CDK or with SAM or with CloudFormation or exactly what the full picture of what your properties are or what you can customize and what you can change and what you can do with it. And I mean, I sometimes even see blog posts from people that are also in the community that are like, I never knew this. I've been working with Lambda for 5 years and this was buried in a doc somewhere. So
Right.
I think as we're starting to mature, it's finding those kind of points where you might miss stuff sometimes, or you might need to shed a light on it to help other folks out too.
Yeah, definitely. Very cool. Thank you. And Tyler, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think a common problem I see is statefulness of services. Like serverless functions are inherently stateless, right? So when we're coming from maybe like a virtual machine or a container background, and we're used to having sort of an in-memory state or easy access to something like that, you have to rethink things a little bit. But I do think it's kind of funny. Sabin, you mentioned something along the lines of like, what's old is new again. And Sabin, you touched on this too. Like coming back around on the form side of things a little bit too. I think the same is happening for some of that state. Like I look at like cookies as a good example of that. Like a cookie is a perfect fit for something like serverless because you can move that state down to the client and just push it back and forth when you need it. But expanding that concept a little bit more broadly, sometimes it takes a little bit of molding of an idea. I found sometimes jumping into a serverless environment, I find myself like hitting a wall of like, well, where am I going to put this? How am I going to not have to do a bunch of IO to get this data back up, which takes a lot of time, especially if you're deploying to the edge and the data lives somewhere else. But sort of like breaking that down and saying, well, maybe I can put it somewhere else. So sometimes I guess more generalized, just rethinking some of the practices to fit the new deployment and mental model of serverless.
Right.
I love that you touched on rethinking old practices and cookies, because that was exactly where I was going with my answer here. I was like formulating it while you guys were talking. But basically, the two things that I think are the pitfalls that beginners can basically run into are, number one, timeouts, and also cookies. So I remember back in the day, I was doing a lot of Heroku and Flask development. So it's like a fully like serverful environment, and the way I would like handle cron jobs were basically just to throw them into an AP scheduler, which is it's just like a server that keeps running 24/7. And going to a serverless environment, it took me a while to figure out like how do I handle timeouts, because like timeouts are like basically when serverless functions have like a 90-second timeout on platforms like Vercel, Cloudflare, etc., depending on how to use it. And that basically forced me to rethink the way I handle cron jobs. And it's actually better for you to chunk basically your processes, and that would also help with if there are any errors that get thrown in the middle, you won't basically just interrupt the entire server function, the server process. Instead, you have chunks which allow you to add like observability checks and stuff like that, and make sure that your cron jobs keep running efficiently and not just crash halfway, which happened to me before when I was using Heroku and Flask. The second one is cookies. And cookies is something that took me a while to figure out how to do like authentication, because back in the day, I would just literally interact with my front end directly inside my Flask server. It was very straightforward. But then moving to serverless, I needed to rethink like how do you authenticate a user via an API route. And Next.auth really helped with that. Prisma is also Prisma functions was also great for me to understand how that would work. So yeah, those are the two main things that I think were gotchas personally as I transitioned from serverful to serverless.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like, and this is something that I think the Remix team on a different subject talks about a lot, but they talk about understanding like the fundamentals of the web, and I think getting into serverless really, it helps if you understand the fundamentals of like the network and how your whole application works. That way you can really understand where these pieces of data should be stored and how they can be the most efficient for this specific application.
Yeah, Yeah, I think that's interesting because it feels like so much of this was designed with serverless in mind, like 20 more years ago. And now it's just kind of coming back around of like, wow, we can just leverage all these things that already exist to make these services just work as we want them to.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But now it's a matter of like learning about those because they kind of fell off the radar for a bit.
Right.
Do you, I guess we'll start with you on this, Tyler. Do you have any good resources that you reference or you look at a lot to like understand these things better as you're developing?
I actually go to MDN quite a bit and look at the actual like specs for these things or not specs, but the APIs for those things specifically. Because as we build a lot on Cloudflare and Workers implements a lot of just the web standards. The same is true for a lot of the modern runtimes. Like I think the Vercel Edge runtime also implements many of those things. I like that centralization a lot because now knowledge is transferring so much better across many of these platforms. And even down to the browser in some cases. So that's where I go for a lot of information besides just Google or some of the AI options out there today. I found that just the API surface and what's available in the documentation there is really good for these runtimes.
Nice. And Kristi, I'm interested to hear your answer to this. Being a AWS hero, like, what do you think are some of the best resources out there for serverless?
Yeah, I'd echo the API comment. I'm in like the CDK docs all the time, looking at like the different properties and types of constructs and all those sorts of things. I'm also a big like command click fan in VS Code to like dig into like the actual code because that never lies and it's not vague like documentation tends to be.
Right.
So I'm a big fan of those. I do like tend to reference actually a lot of like previous AWS like blog announcements, like when they first come out with something and they're like, oh, it has these features, and you kind of like skim it and then like you go back and try it and then you like go back again and be like, well, what else can I use from this, or like how do I actually implement that? So I tend to use like a lot of announcements and things for that reason. And then just in general, I'm part of like a lot of Slack communities too. I find that like that's really helpful. It's almost like a live Stack Overflow of folks that are there asking questions about the CDK Dev Slack's a good one. And then we have personal ones for like community builders and heroes. So it's a great place to kind of like bounce ideas off of, or just be like, am I thinking about this wrong? Like, is there another way to do this, or something along those lines? So I definitely utilize the community quite a bit.
Cool. Awesome. What about you, Steven?
Yeah, I like that you mentioned command click. That's I literally do that stuff all the time. And it's actually so I used to hate TypeScript when I first learned. I was like 2 years ago, I was really new to type safety and stuff like that. But then I realized that TypeScript is not you shouldn't think of TypeScript as a set of rules. Instead, you should think of it more of like a documentation tool, because you can literally click on stuff, command click on like objects or functions or methods, and see like what's happening under the hood, what attributes that the function takes. And it's just so much better for you to understand what a particular SDK or library does. So that's one thing. Another thing is Next.js has been moving a lot and emulating what Remix team is doing, but basically going back to the fundamentals of the web. Like we replaced in the new like app router API routes, we call them route handlers. Instead of using a specific like Next API request type, we go back to the original like request type, which is like what's been existing on the web. And if there's something that's Next.js specific, we would just add a polyfill to the exact like function. So that's something that I think the Next.js docs is getting much more easy to understand. And one last thing is, at the risk of me getting booed off this stage, is ChatGPT. It's something that I use as a last resort sometimes, but also at other times it's also very easy for you to fix type errors. And then GitHub Copilot is another thing that they have added, like GitHub Copilot X, which allows you to chat with Copilot and figure out what's wrong with your types. So that's another thing that's been great for when I really can't figure out what's happening, or I'm just too lazy to dive into the docs. That's another option too.
Yeah, that actually gets me thinking. I mean, when Copilot first came out and ChatGPT and things like that came out, they were really cool, but like a lot of people treated them as sort of like a joke when getting like development help from them. And they've advanced a lot now. Now the general sentiment that I see online is that they're cool and useful. How do you guys feel about using AI to help develop? Yeah, sorry, I should pick somebody to go first. Tyler, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I'm getting more and more comfortable with it. At first, I was a bit hesitant too. I found some of the early tools generating things that weren't quite right enough, and I've just write it myself. But they're getting so accurate now, especially when it comes to maybe a more complex like chain of problems. That's where I found that something like ChatGPT is really good when you can define like I want to do this, I want to do it a particular way, and this is what I want the outcome to be in the format of. And it can just structure all these things together where you might have to jump to like 3 or 4 different documentations out on the internet. It can just like pull all that together and give you just, here's a function that does exactly what you asked for. And then you can have that dialogue with it. Like sometimes it'll give me something and I'm like, I actually wanted it to use like, rather than using like an array, I want to use an iterable here so I don't have to read it all into memory. And it'll like rephrase and say, okay, here you go. Here's the iterable version. So that's where I'm getting more of a fan of it. I have leaned on that more recently than ever.
Interesting. Yeah, very cool. And Kristi, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that the AI boom is very interesting. I mean, I mentioned earlier, in my grad school, I actually took a class a couple of years ago on machine learning and another one on AI, and like have done the actual like training of a model, and I have some code up there in GitHub, so I kind of know what it looks like. I'd say that I think for the tools like Copilot and like Code Whisperer and some of those, I think that they're awesome tools. I would love to use AI for some of that. I mean, I'm definitely looking at some of that for some of the development work that I've been doing. And AI in general, I'm a wait and see person. I'm in the skeptic area where I kind of want to see. I'm actually also very curious. I've actually asked some friends and family members too, like how much that they've been part of that bubble, or how much of it's just like really hyper specific to tech and like people that know it and are excited about it, and how much it's really translated over into the real world, so to speak. So I find it really interesting. I think that for me, I'd go as far as coding and developer tools. I don't know if I would completely rely on it for everything. Like you still need that check there, for sure. Maybe there'll be a day where we won't, and it's totally fine. But I have the caution tape up around it a little bit more.
Yeah, makes sense. I tend to fall on the same lines as you, Kristi. I don't have a lot of, I guess my experience is different from yours. I haven't really touched AI a whole lot for those reasons, though. I'm kind of like iffy about it. I'm still sort of gauging the general like opinion on it and things like that. So, Steven, you said you've been working with AI a lot recently. So how do you feel about all this?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned tests, because that's something that as like the AI becomes more of a norm in your workflow, you got to get better at testing. So basically, you can just ask AI to come up with whatever function. You just got to make sure that it runs correctly, and that's why you need to be good at writing tests. Although AI can help with that too, but there has been, I understand that there's been like some pushback from like the developer community, more recently the MDN docs that tried to add AI, and like people push back really hard. So I think there is, because like in development there the sort of, it's not opportunity cost, but like the potential losses that could be caused by an incorrect function that's written by AI is relatively high than a lot of other spaces. So it's definitely very important to verify and not trust it completely, but take it with like as a guidance sort of thing. So that's the only thing I would say.
For sure. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I've seen that argument brought up a couple times online on Twitter and things like that, where people foresee a future where we do rely more on AI to help build our functions, where we take more of like a passenger role in the development experience, where we're verifying what AI wrote works and that it works specifically for our situation. So it's interesting to hear all three of your opinions on these. I think actually we're coming up on time. So unless anyone has any specific questions that they wanted to chat about between us, then I think we can go ahead and wrap it up here. And yeah, so I'll take that as a no more questions. So thank you, all three of you, for coming on. This was a really great episode. Had some great conversations. And in the notes to this stream, I'll add all the links that you guys talked about and posted. That way people can go back and find them, as well as your socials. But yeah, thanks for joining us. And I think I'll transition over and we'll close this thing out.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, y'all.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us for this 4th episode of Serverless Deep Dives. We plan to continue to doing these events and bringing on more cool guests like Kristi and Steven and Tyler. And if you have any questions about serverless in general, be sure to tune into the next episodes and come with your questions and post them in the comments. But yeah, thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time.